Jenny Wu, who is the educational neuroscience researcher, founder, and podcaster for Mind Brain Parenting. She's here to present our topic for today.
Thanks so much, Betty. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. And a little bit about myself. I've always been in human development in terms of big people and small human beings. Started off as a management consultant, so kind of done a lot of learning and development, human development in the corporate workplace. Of course, then had children, and so I have 3 children who are incredibly different from each other. I think some of you can relate to that. And I helped to found a Montessori school, as well as then getting my master's in education from Harvard University. And I also have an MBA from Berkeley. So welcome. Okay, so for today's agenda, we are going to look at a few things. We'll start with really understanding what is social and emotional development. How does that look in the brain, and how does it translate into our children or students' day-to-day behaviors and what we're seeing? Then we'll go into social emotional learning, what it is. I think some of you might have heard this as an important topic floating around these days in terms of education, but also in the context of mental health. And so we'll talk about what it means and some of the other differences. And, you know, when we hear about emotional intelligence, 21st century skills, critical thinking skills, how they all come together. Then I'll share with you some of my key research findings that you would benefit in knowing as an informed parent or an educator or both. And why is it that social emotional learning skills are important? What has been done and what has really not been done, and where we can go from here in terms of helping our children to build those skills. And lastly is really sort of the meat, right? So we've obviously heard a lot of research and have seen a lot of things, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is, what can we do about it as parents and teachers? So I'll share with you some practical and evidence-based strategies, as well as the social emotional learning game that I had developed when I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which is now used in all 50 states and 32 countries. So let's go ahead and get started with some science, just to have you understand what it is, right? So social emotional development, what you see on the slide is a snapshot of children's brain developmentally from age 5 to 20. And as an educational neuroscientist, I've heard plenty of brain development myths from both parents and educators, and even from myself. And, you know, examples are you only use 10% of the brain, or we're either visual or auditory learners, or right or left brained people. And so I have actually a free resource, a quiz that you can take that will help you debunk some of that on my website, which I can share at the end. But really the myth today that I like to clarify is this timing and trajectory of children's brain development. And clearly, as you can see from the slide, the brain actually doesn't entirely mature until way much into the 20s. And, you know, just to go back with something you might have heard, I saw that some of you have children who are between 5 to 10 years old, right? So if you have some exposure to Montessori schools, whether your children go there, you've heard of it, you might have came across this notion called sensitive period. And when I was heading up a language immersion Montessori preschool, we really talked about that in the context of, you know, building your fine or gross motor skills or acquiring a new language. Sort of this sensitive period is when the brain is particularly responsive to learning certain skills. And the context we hear a lot as parents are the 0 to 6 year of age, where it's sort of like that magic window where they're sponging everything up. But on the flip side, one thing I like to warn you with this, looking at this picture, is that, you know, as parents, we feel incredibly pressured that we need to get it in. We need to, you know, develop our children because that's going to be too late, or, you know, that sensitive period window is going to close up beyond 6 or 8 years old. And that is really not true. And it's never too late, and it's actually just as critical beyond the 6 years in the context of specifically supporting children's social and emotional development. So what does that mean, right? you might have heard of this term called executive function skills. And that is a particular skill that it works like the air traffic control system for our brain. And this, I'm speaking to the front part of the brain, which is called prefrontal cortex. But without getting, don't really need to remember these terms. The thing you need to remember is that this air traffic control system really takes a long time to mature, to get to know the flow of things. And as you can see, it's beyond age 20 years old. And it translates into how our children manage incoming information, deciding which ones they need to listen to, they prioritize, and then directing their actions and behaviors in a way that makes sense, that is socially appropriate, for example. And these are the type of things that actually tend to push our buttons as parents and educators, right? So to translate it, right, it controls or influences how children focus and shift their attention, how they might deal with distractions. So in the classroom, this translates into whether a child is too focused. And so then, gets really mad when it's time for class transitions, or is not focused enough, right? I think we've all sort of experienced that either on the receiving end or the end that's kind of witnessing it. It also deals with how children control brief impulses, right? Having that tantrum at the most inconvenient time, at the most inconvenient place, or ability to keep a secret. And then also very important is how they regulate and express their emotions. And it also has to do with remembering things, their working memory, which, we might ask as educators or parents, why does my 5-year-old have the memory of a goldfish? I had to tell this kid, over and over multiple times of when not to do something, right? And they come back and do the same thing. And so it sort of explains why that is, right? Because it really takes time to develop. And so some of the examples just to share with you, right? For ages 3 to 7 years old, around that time, they're really developing these skills, what neuroscientists call theory of mind. But really what it means is to learn how to take other people's perspectives. And they're also growingly able to tolerate their own sort of emotional frustrations and being able to delay gratification. But that work is really not done yet. And so that self-management continues through middle childhood, which is 8 to 11 years old, when they're able to, regulate themselves a little bit better, and also increasingly able to become aware of their own thoughts. Like, I am observing that I am thinking about this, right? And then having more interest in developing friendships and what popularity sort of means, this new concept, all the way to adolescent, which, that entirely just flips the formula. Specific glands in the brain do drive the maturation process. And so during the puberty stage, right, when the hormones are coursing through the body, this central air traffic control system really do go haywire, especially during those times. So we may have witnessed a teenager bursting into tears or becoming super heightened in terms of sensitivity to criticism. Those are very much examples. So sometimes as parents or educators, we may think, well, why we went through this? Why is my child doing this again, or that regression, right? But it's really the brain's way of continuing to develop and to mature. And so this full range of ability in terms of executive function, social emotional development, really doesn't mature till early adulthood. So what can we do about it, right? Some are sort of nature, but what can we do to facilitate that environment and that support that they need during these uncertain times, and to really develop the skills and capacity? And so the good news is that scientists have found that these skills can be learned. So that's amazing news. And in fact, it actually gets better through practice. So what can we do, right? What can we do as supporting adults? And that leads into social emotional learning. So you might have heard this in many different contexts, but honestly, people say it differently, but it's really the same concept. So for example, when I was supporting executives with their leadership development and all that stuff in the corporate world, I heard a lot of emotional intelligence and that soft skills that you might have heard as well. When I was a school administrator, or if you're an educator, you definitely have heard some of the latest, hottest buzzing words like growth mindset, grit, you know. And there are actually myths around that as well, which I have in a podcast that's free for all, which I can share at the end. And then, of course, we also hear character building, right? That may be one of the values of the schools that your children attend. So what do those things really mean, right? They actually all come together and mean that social emotional learning. And it's the set of skills that we build that, for example, contributes into 21st century skills like innovation, critical thinking, and being able to problem solve. And that is why it's super important. And so just to follow up with some research to help you understand, the following slide that's pulling up is some of the key research. And before we step in, right, one thing I want to highlight is that collectively, it's telling us that social emotional skills predict academic achievement better than IQ. So I just want that to soak in. This has been you know, replicated and really verified in terms of the academic research and learning journals. And so that, and you can, you know, it makes you wonder, why is it, right? So going back to those executive function skills, right? If a child cannot pay attention in class, cannot build healthy relationship and social interactions, or know when to raise hands and when to maybe let other people talk, that collaborative skills, right? So that's where the magic happens in terms of your ability to learn and engage and be inspired by the academic content. And one famous neuroscientist said, it's, you know, through her research, it's neurobiologically impossible to build memories, engage in complex thoughts, or make meaningful decisions without emotion. Right, and so you can imagine during the times when the emotions are going wild, haywire, and our children don't have the ability to really recognize and unpack what is it that they're feeling, to be able to express that, articulate it in a way that adults can understand what is it that they need, you know, and this is one area, for example, why toddlers get really mad, right, because they don't have the language to express themselves. And that self-awareness. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I wanted to show with this is that there has been repeated research that have found that children who have really been deliberately supported in terms of their social emotional development and those skills, they actually produce way more in terms of academic grades and performance. And then increases high school graduation rates, college enrollment. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know, the latest number for college dropouts is actually close to 50%, like half of that, right? And as parents, you know, the old days were like, okay, let's just get them to graduate high school, go to college, and then my job is done, right? But just something to think about. To have those skills, it actually enables you to self-manage, right? Dealing with adversities and uncertainties and new environments, and to be able to create that resiliency to pull through. Suicide, unfortunately, I you know, have to bring this up, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the latest happenings. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death in ages 10 to 34, and fourth in ages 44, 45 to 44. And you know, unfortunately, it's as parents are, with the increase in terms of social media, bullying, and the topics that are floating around these days are sort of, our roles have really been broadened, where we need to think about mental health issues just as much as academic issues. So that is an area where it is found to buffer children's growth. And really, so let's talk about, what's been done and what needs to be done, right? So 8 out of 10 employers say that these skills are the most critical to success, but on a survey, they actually said they're the hardest skills to find. And also a national survey, 4 in 5 teachers really need more support. How do we integrate these skills and learning opportunities into the daily busyness of academic teaching and learning, right? So lastly, the other research I want to show you, which is quite profound before we dive into what can we do about it, right, is this latest research actually from last year around Valentine's Day. It came out, and at that time I was actually I was at the MIT Media Lab and also researching at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so the lead author on this research, the lead researcher, I can attest to that. We both share the typical and atypical neurodevelopment class over at Harvard. And what this research say is that the back and forth conversations, that interaction between parent and child, or really between a supporting adult and child, is key to children's brain development, to language, and to so much more. And where this is kind of interesting is, as some of you might have heard, the 30 million word gap, especially if you're in education, which is that a landmark 1995 study found that children from higher income families hear about 30 million more words during their first 3 years of life than children from lower income families. And so because of this study, it's sort of attributed to the fact that you need to talk more, read more, lots of language, as a way to bridge that difference in vocabulary, language development, literacy. And so, you can imagine as a parent, when you go to the pediatrician's office, you ask for advice, or when you talk to your child's teacher, what can I do at home, right? What's the #1 advice you get? Which is read to your child. And I got this a whole lot as a parent when my children were growing up. And I diligently, tried as much as I can to do that. But what this research say that is we're kind of missing the bigger picture, the real point behind it, that it's not merely the number of words, but it's actually that interaction, that social emotional connectedness through the back and forth interaction of the conversations between an adult and a child that appears to neurobiologically change the child's brain. That's pretty incredible, right? And so they coined it as the conversational turns. And that really was the one that accounted for the large portion of differences in brain physiology and language skills that they found among children. So this finding suggests that, parents and educators can have considerable influence over the children's language and brain development by simply talking to them, engaging them in conversation. And, it's one thing I want to highlight is that the important thing is not just talk to your child, but talk with your child, right? As parents, we tend to get into that questioning mode, interrogation, or lecturing mode. That is not as effective as really genuinely listening, right? Listening to your child and following that up with questions and conversations. And so one thing I want to debunk from here as an example is you might have heard of baby Einstein, right? When our children were just teeny tiny babies. And one of the things with baby Einstein was that it claimed that the programming that it provided boosted children's brain development, IQ, and vocabulary. And, there's a bunch of other stuff on the market around that. I'm sure you've heard of many of the other ones. And in fact, baby Einstein ended up getting fined for claiming this. And researchers were testing it on the efficacy of this. And what they found was that for every hour a day that babies watched baby Einstein videos, they actually knew 6 to 8 fewer words than their peers. And, watching something like baby Wordsworth actually did not improve 1- and 2-year-olds' language development. And the earlier a child started watching baby Einstein videos, in fact, the smaller his vocabulary. So don't, if you're like me that have utilized baby Einstein here and there and, really believed in it, don't be afraid. It's never too late, again, looking at the brain development, but I do want to give you this example to showcase why is it that the interaction is more important, right, than simply just having the words flash before your eyes or ears. And it really goes down to this quote from Mr. Rogers. I had to bring him out. And it says, I feel so strongly that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. In the end, life isn't about material things. It's about the relationship you have with one another and yourself. And so this sort of really encapsulates that essence that, it's all about the relationships, because those relationships buffer and create the type of safe and brave environments that enable our children to learn, to feel safe about vocalizing their opinions, to be themselves, and to have that full sense of belonging in whether it's a classroom or a club or at home. And that's really when you feel safe, engaged, that's where the learning happens cognitively. And, if there is a negative environment, if your child is dealing with something serious or something not so positive, the relationships are also the one to buffer those occasions, right, that are less ideal. And so really it's not about the quantity, but it's the quality itself that counts. And as you've seen through brain development, our children really develops to the mid-20s. And so can't let up, right? During all these times, they go through different milestones. And as parents, we really have to be mindful of adjusting accordingly, depending on what is it that they need. And so in some ways, we also need to develop as parents, of whether it's adolescent or toddlers or teenagers, things around that. And so, for example, I've worked with children anywhere from K, or actually pre-K and preschool, all the way to, now working as a researcher here at UCI, having conducted a lot of workshops in freshman dorm room and all that stuff. And I can attest to that, if you don't continue to work on this and have those deep conversations, what I'm seeing is that children, like college students, even age, they really don't know who they are or what they want to do, right? What is that sense of identity that they might have? So that is really, really important to think about. And I think I have a few videos of children of different ages on my website that you can help you understand what they find as important and sort of profound in terms of driving their sense of self-competency, self-worth, and self-esteem. And one of the examples just to share with you is, this has actually happened at a workshop I had done, a family workshop at a local middle school. And it's a collection of the things I've been hearing just from other workshops, but I tested out and I said, parents, how many of you do you feel like this, right? Why won't my child listen to me? And the parents nodded. I said, clap if you feel that way, right? And then I said, well, this is another thing that I've been hearing from children a lot. And so students in the room, if you feel this way, why can't my parents stop lecturing and just hear me out? Clap. And what do you think happens, right? Way more clapping than how the parents were clapping. And, I'll run through a couple more just to give you a sense, right? Parents may say, how do I help my child to stay away from bad peer influence? So many parents nodded, how do I do that? That's a huge thing that keeps me up late at night, right? A parent might say. And the child says, why can't my parents stop comparing me to my friends, right? What's the difference between that? It's seemingly different questions, but there is some truth to the needs from both ends, but talking it sort of that disconnect And the last one is, how can my child be more self-motivated, right? That's what we want as parents. And the children says, my parents need to trust me and stop telling me what to do. And let me tell you, when I put this one up, I had a room full of students with their parents, but the students were clapping so loudly. In fact, one kid who was a middle schooler age, he actually got on the table and clapped. Like, just in case if you didn't notice me, I am clapping loudly. So that gives you some sort of day-to-day insights and this disconnect, right? It's always easy on paper. Yes, I talk to my children at dinner table, in the car. I'm going to have these conversations, but how do we actually do that without having fights, arguments, or kind of like, you just don't get me type of situation, right? So let's talk more about what these skills are. And so I think that framework that you're seeing will help us lead forward into what can we do mindfully without driving ourselves nuts or our children, in a way to support them and build these skills. So social emotional learning skills really break down into about 3 buckets. Now, the ones that you see at the top in orange are self-management and self-awareness. And those are the intra dimensions, meaning dealing with the self. Like, how can I regulate my own emotions, thoughts, behaviors in a way that is productive, right? But even before I do that, I need to first know what I'm feeling, right? Being able to understand that and confront that for myself internally, and understanding my strengths and limitations in a very realistic way. And then, and the blue is the interpersonal skills. So social awareness, right? Being able to understand social cues, right? That's very important. And I work with speech language pathologists in, looking at the pragmatics of understanding that with children. And so that is a key thing, right? And here at UC, I also do research with gifted as well as ADHD children. And so social behaviors and self-management in terms of social skills is really important. And then relationship skills, right? How do I know what a good friendship looks like, right? That give and take, and really build that support. How do I collaborate with others? How do I have productive disagreements? And then lastly, knowing all these things, how do I make my decision in a developmentally, responsive way, right? And this is where it really is, our children's behaviors and decisions on doing something. And this is where we really want to think about it in the context of mental health, depression, bullying, and suicide, right? So the type of ethical or healthy relationships and decisions that they make are incredibly important. So one of the examples I want to share with you on the game that I had created, which won the 2018 Parents' Choice Awards, is this one deceptively harmless card. And it's on the topic of identity. So imagine it says, describe who you are. How would your friend describe you? Your teacher, your parents, right? Just looking at the top side of the question, what of those social emotional competencies do you think it deals with, right? So in order to describe who they are, they have to sort of be aware of who they are, right? But then also to take perspectives on how your friend would describe you versus your teacher, your parents, and that is social awareness. And the fact that, when I did this card with different students and along with families, one of the insights I've found is that your kids will tell you that, oh, my teacher thinks me this way. My friends say this about me. But, oh, my parents, they always say this, right? And you find those incongruencies that are incredibly insightful. And then you ask, well, what do you think of yourself, right? How do what other people think of you inform how you approach yourself? And I can tell you I did this actually also at an undergraduate dorm. And without getting too much into it, it was really groundbreaking for this particular person. And so you can imagine just simply talking to your child asking certain questions in a very strategic way and knowing what to look for and hear for brings tremendous insight. So I don't want to overwhelm parents or teachers. We are so busy, right? But one little question makes a big difference. You have to know what to look for and how to ask those questions. And by the way, what does this question remind you of? You know, I ask that of my students. And, you know, it's actually sort of a job interview, right? Describe yourself to me. That's one of the most common job interviews that we get, or our children will get when they have their first job, their internship, right? And the second one, think of two people you know, what do you have in common or unique? I mean, that's almost like another job interview question. Why should I hire you, right? What do you bring to the table? So through these questions, it actually extends quite broadly into not only understanding yourself and others of your perceptions of yourself, but how do you sort of portray yourself, manage yourself, and where do you want to be? What do you want to be known as? So that's an example of the cards that I developed. So the nuance of that, what really complicates everything is the fact that, again, you know, we started with the slide of the brain developing differently at different ages. And when I mentioned I have 3 very different children, they all have different developmental timing and trajectory and strength and weakness. So that's where it's really overwhelming and confusing for us as supporting adults, because, well, what do we do? You know, if I have a 5-year-old, what is it that I need to do and think about? And how do I do it? Versus if my 5-year-old, you know, now is a 10-year-old, my strategies are going to be different. And what I'm going to emphasize on are going to be very, very different too. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are building block skills that fundamentally children need to work on first before progressing to the next one, right? So for example, if we look at, there's the cognitive domain, emotional and social, interpersonal, right? So emotional domain, just to use that easy one, right, that I had already discussed, is understanding and recognizing emotions of yourself, you know, before you can even do it to others, and building strategies on how to manage those emotions. And, you know, for whether it's a child who is quite gifted, who might be dealing with, you know, like, why can't this other child understand what I'm saying, or do, you know, like in his head, he might see that makes perfect sense, right? But it's really developing that skill to be able to have the patience to understand others' perspective, to know how to use different strategies and the toolkit to get the point across. And so that's the fundamental building block of early childhood. And it progresses to, well, now that you do, how are you going to recognize emotion and express that in a way that makes sense? And emerging empathy, right? We talk about kindness at schools a lot, and empathy is a huge thing. And of course, then it progresses up even more. So it gets really overwhelming and complex. And then when you have siblings and, you know, like children of different ages, it's maddening. So let's talk about what we can do about it. So this was something I developed when I was at Harvard, and really it grew out of my frustration dealing with, you know, there's tons of research out there of what they've found, and, you know, some you have seen, but at the end of the day, I interviewed a whole lot of researchers, domain experts of their fields, and I said, well, okay, this is great. Well, what can we do about it? And sadly, the answers I get from developmental psychologists or neuroscientists or researchers are commonly like, well, I don't know, you know, that's not sort of, in a way, it's kind of like, well, my focus is researching, right? Testing and experiments and laboratories, but in the real world, right? As parents and educators, what do we do about it? It's great that we know all these things, but what can we do? And so out of the frustration as a parent and researcher myself, but Yeah, so I developed these 2 decks of cards. And these decks of cards are actually coded developmentally so that those cascades of building blocks that you saw are actually part of the cards. Except it's self-guided. It helps you as parents and teachers know which cards to use first. And it's also coded in a way that focuses on all the core competencies that I went over. So for example, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and all that stuff. And in addition, I included other competencies that in my research of the latest social emotional learning curriculums out there, especially the top 25 I've seen that are widely used, what they were lacking. And so, for example, they might be more prescriptive. They don't really celebrate your own personal heritage, right? Your family heritage or your community heritage. And it is almost a little, cookie cutter approach where the same curriculum you use in 3rd grade, you also use in 5th grade or high school. And research also found that a learning intervention that's successfully done in middle school actually has opposite effect in high school, right? And partly because during that developmental stage of adolescence, one of the things that they interestingly do or are more drawn to is to be the opposite of parents. So our strategies are also need to be different. So these 2 decks, one is 52 Essential Conversations. This one is, as I mentioned, now in all 50 states and 32 countries, won the 2018 Parents' Choice Awards, and it focuses specifically around these competencies, but also bring out your social skills, mindfulness, character education, 21st century skills, and critical thinking. And it's sequenced by mastery level. So it's for ages 5 all the way. I actually use it, grandparents use it with their children as well, so, and also adults. And then the newer deck is the one that's called 52 Essential Relationships, and it's an emotional intelligence skill building game. And this one is actually free for all, so I've actually facilitated adult conferences using a few cards from this game. So it can be done for team building in school or at work, and it focuses around more on emotional mastery and your communication skills. How do I communicate to build productive relationships? And a lot of these days, whether it's working with adults and children, what I've found is a common theme of that we don't know how to ask for help. Whether it's because we align that with it's a sign of weakness, or we just don't know how to start, how to get to the point. And so this deck is, I included competencies around power mentorship, right? And after school program person or a counselor, how does that person be able to work with a child to really understand what the child needs, right? And then also conflict mediator, and this has also done with couples. How do I get on the same page, whether it's how our decisions with what to do with our child's next step in terms of education or extracurriculars, or just in general, and our philosophies on life. So just to dive deeper on one, this is 52 Essential Conversations. It's a deck of playing cards, so super portable, anytime, anywhere. I have parents using it and the cards on the way to school or back or in between extracurriculars, or it's mostly used parents-wise at the dinner table. Or if you're taking a hike, just bring a couple of cards with you. They're self-guided. The hearts are self-awareness, diamonds, and it goes on that. And the aces, which I found that, little kids love to be powerful. So the ace are actually the first topic to start. And it, starts with recognizing emotions. What does it mean to be attentive? And so then it really works up to the harder concepts. For example, you see the hearts of king is implicit bias. I actually have a series of podcasts on that topic. And so this enables you, so each of the cards includes sets of questions and gamified activities. So through personal storytelling, self-reflections, mindfulness, and different types of fun activities, children and supporting adults can go ahead and have those engaging conversations and really learn about each other, about ourselves, and about the world, real-life topics through those conversations. So the card is actually done in both homes. In terms of classrooms, I just had an elementary who is getting a deck for each classroom for the core teachers to bridge lesson plans and having social circle discussions, advisory to high schools using it for restorative practices, and middle schooler using it in conjunction with parents at home. So that is what it is. But I want to bring you to resources, right? So if you are interested in getting the games, right now, let's see, you can get 52 Essential Conversations on Amazon. It's actually Amazon's choice for social emotional learning. So this is a link, or you can do it freely, do it on my website as well. And I have some free resources for you. So I mentioned the neural myth quiz for parents and educators. Feel free to take that free quiz. It includes additional myths that are related to, for example, adolescent development or learning differences, gender differences, things around that. And I also have a free podcast series. You can go on my website and listen to it. It actually includes many of the topics that you see from 52 Essential Conversations, where I interview my colleagues here at UCI as well as Harvard and different amazing educators out in the trenches about what we can do as parents and educators in school and homes. And, you know, if you have any questions, I also left my email address. Feel free to email me directly. I am doing various workshops around the area. And so if you find this webinar informative and practical and useful, feel free to contact me if you like a similar webinar or a webinar on a different topic or a workshop at your school or parent organization. So this concludes my presentation, but we still have about 8 minutes left. So if there is any questions that you have right here and then, feel free to type it directly into the chat box. And, you know, make sure you put to all panelists and attendees. So this is any questions, definitely feel free to type something in.
So we do have some questions that came in. The first question is, where will the recording of the webinar be posted? This webinar will be posted on our UCI DCE On Demand page. So at the time when you register for this webinar, under free events, there is actually a tab that says On Demand. Once you click on that tab, it'll show up this webinar. It should be posted within 24 hours. And it'll also be available on our UCI DCE YouTube page. You will also receive a recording to this webinar by email.
And also one thing I forgot to mention is I do have monthly resources, newsletter, as well as upcoming webinars. And so if you are interested in slides like this and additional information to really dive deeper in terms of cognitive development, emotional and social, feel free to go to my website, mindbrainparenting.org. And I believe once you're on the website, you'll get an opportunity that there's an area that will pop up asking if you are interested in subscribing to the monthly newsletter that you can just go ahead and type in an email address. And another thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that I am actually currently launching a University IRB approved study. So this is done at UCI. It's a study on social emotional learning. So if you are interested in participating in this free study as a family or as a school, feel free to contact my email, jwu@mindbrainparenting.org, and the study is going on right now. I also mentioned we work with ADHD children. If that's something you're also interested in, feel free to put that in. And I know that one, we do offer a monetary incentive for participating in the study from our lab. And we also run another study, sorry, just pulling at it, around older adults in terms of executive function. So yeah, any questions? But let's see, okay, sorry. So we have a question coming in and it says, what advice would you give to a parent who has a gifted child who continues to be disruptive in class, shouting out answers, talking with other students during class? Is this more of an emotional intelligence problem or one of him, her being gifted and bored? Okay, so thank you for the question. And yes, your first step is correct, which is properly diagnosing, right? Why is it that the behavior is manifesting in such way? Because a lot of the times what is labeled as troublemakers are misunderstood, right? We are often rushing to understand, to say, well, okay, this person is being so disruptive, this person has problems, or, you know, this kid is, you know, bored. And so you're right. So honestly, without knowing the full context, I cannot tell you it's one or the other, but I think you're at the right step. And what I would do is first talk to your child, which I'm sure you have, but really understand let your child give you examples, you know, of why or when he or she tends to do that. Right? And what is that child feeling? Is it out of boredom, or like, why is my teacher going so slowly? Or is it more of, oh, I have another thought, I have another idea, but it's really not on topic to what the teacher is saying. So there is a little bit of truth to both of these, right? And so you can imagine, even if you're gifted and bored, it's actually a great opportunity to practice self-regulation, right? To practice impulse control, because in life, we are in the real world, we are going to have to deal with people who are very different from us and who, you know, work differently, think differently, and we disagree. So you can present it as an opportunity or a challenge to your gifted child and say, well, let's try it this way today, you know, count how many times you were going to say something, but you did not. And one book that I recommend is My Mouth is a Volcano. I used to read that to my children, right? So vocalizing exactly what you're thinking and not being able to understand what other people, whether they need that type of thought or not. So check out that book and talk to your child, have those conversations, talk to the teacher about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for your very informational webinar. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. But if you do have any additional questions, feel free to contact our program director or contact myself. My information is on the screen. And you also do have Jenny's email. So if you do have any specific questions that we did not address in this webinar, feel free to send them to her. Thank you so much for attending this webinar today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.